Learn more about the fatal Washington DC collision between an American Airlines regional jet and an Army Black Hawk helicopter. We're asking the question, is Donald Trump right to link DEI to the collision and to do it so soon? This is Ticker Hot Shots. Hello, I'm Aaron Young. Great to be with you as always. Coming up on the program today, Donald Trump doubling down on DEI. So many questions about it and a lot of responses too. Australian Jews forced to boost security with some big concerns that we could be on the cusp of a major attack. Also, puberty blockers review in Australia for young transgendered or people who want to transition. What does it mean? And is the government trying to head off an election issue? Plus, Harry and Meghan, they are back in the spotlight again. Hollywood, are they turning off them? And what about that Netflix special as well, which is meant to be the comeback? To help break it all down today, we're joined by Ashley Gardner. Great to see you.
Great to be here. Is it February already?
It is February already, and there is so much to get through because Donald Trump, it's been 2 weeks so far. Let's kick off with him. President Trump has reiterated his belief that the recent midair collision near Reagan Washington National Airport was linked to diversity, equity and inclusion hiring practices. This is the headline here from The Hill. Trump doubling down on DEI attacks in wake of DCA crash. He's accused previous administrations of prioritising those with psychiatric disabilities over psychological quality when it comes to air traffic control. Also, Trump says that the need for top psychological standards, suggesting the helicopter involved may have been flying too high at the time of the crash that tragically claimed those 67 lives. Here he is.
And I do want to point out that various articles that appeared prior to my entering office, and here's one. The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. And then it says FAA says people with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in and they can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so.
His remarks have drawn sharp criticism from lawmakers who urge respect for grieving families and call for a thorough investigation. Ash, your thoughts on this? Because the question mark that Donald Trump puts there may be an important question to ask, but it's the timing and the sensitivity that I think has really hit him.
Yeah, I think this is an occasion of classic Trump being Trump. Now, yes, there may be questions to raise about hiring policies in the FAA and indeed many other agencies in the US government. But to go into that press conference so soon after the incident and drop that, what are you saying about this particular incident? I guess, this, as I say, this is Trump being Trump, but he's now in government.
Yes, I don't know if he knows something that perhaps the rest of us didn't know. Very quickly it emerged, this story. New York Post, FAA embroiled in a lawsuit alleging it turned away 1,000 applicants based on race that contributed to staffing woes. So the story is that about 1,000 white males are essentially trying to sue the FAA, saying we weren't hired because of diversity targets. Now, President Trump talking there about people with psychiatric issues, that they are the people that they're trying to find as air traffic controllers. I don't know how I feel about that because obviously a human being is a very complex person, and as we have seen in the past, you think of the Germanwings pilot who passed all sorts of psychiatric tests only to crash into the Alps, the plane killing all those people. How would you ever know?
Yeah, look, it's just, I'm really sure, I really trust that people with severe psychological disorders are not being given work as air traffic controllers. Maybe, if this is to be believed, that we're talking about other areas of the agency. Now, the reality is that the workforce, the air traffic control workforce, is largely male, is largely white. And yes, there could be advantages to widening the pool of people who work in the agency. Now, the problem, this gets to the heart of the problem of DEI policies. It's on the face of it, it's a very worthy exercise to open up opportunities who may have been wrongly denied them. But the problem is in the implementation, and what we see happening is that so often people are being shut out of opportunities in order for targets to be made.
In order to not be discriminatory, you inadvertently become discriminatory. That is essentially what this article is about, right? The FAA embroiled in a lawsuit alleging it turned away 1,000 applicants based on race, when it's trying to create diversity targets to prevent the very thing that it ends up achieving, and that means that someone loses out. And many studies are finding that a lot of males are saying that they are losing out in these DEI targets who then voted for Trump. Let's have a listen to Jake Tapper, who was doing an interview about this very subject.
Is there any specific evidence that backs up Donald Trump's claims, President Trump's claims, that DEI or FAA hiring practices are responsible in any way for this tragedy at Reagan National?
So, Jake, I think the better question is, am I going to guarantee the American people that only the best and the brightest serve in this incredibly important body of the Department of Transportation, that they're driven by safety and DEI doesn't matter? So I do know that in the last administration, they were focused on not safety, but they were focused on changing the name from cockpit to flight deck. Or notice to airmen, they want to change it to notice to air mission. They focused on EVs and sustainability and racist roads, things that don't matter in regard to safety. Our mission since the start has been safety, and they've lost that mission. And we see when you don't focus on safety and you focus on social justice or the environment, bad things happen. And so listen, it's been busy. We're going to have a fuller assessment of what happens in regard to DEI in FAA and DOT.
All right, that is obviously Trump's new transportation secretary being questioned there. And as he said, with that famous thing that we as journalists hate, which is you ask a question and then they say, I've got a better question. And that is, why are they moving on to things that shouldn't really matter? The issue that I have is that the evidence so far is that the three pilots, this is the female soldier who was on board the Black Hawk helicopter, her family did not for quite some time want her to be identified, obviously because of some fears about DEI, right? And that is where we end up. It can go the other way and the pendulum can swing each way. What are your views on it?
Yeah, well, this is something that has been conflated in recent days, that Trump was, in his comments about DEI, Trump was, I guess, making comments about the piloting of the helicopter. Now, my reading of Trump's comments, he did not say that, but it's easy for these two things to be conflated. And I guess this is the problem now with this particular issue. Rather than a focus on the facts, it's now become it's entered
political.
the zone. It's political. It's entered cultural zones when we're actually talking about a tragic incident where the facts really matter.
Yeah, and let's let the NTSB get in there. This is something that has happened out of the blue. It's not as if it happens every second Tuesday, but the helicopters have been too close for too long, according to pilots who have warned for some time about coming into Reagan. Also, questions about Congress. Politicians love flying out of Reagan because it's so close. I remember flying out of Reagan a few years ago, and the people that I was with were like, you're so lucky, it's so much closer than going to the other airport, which takes forever to get to. So they've been pushing up the number of flights out of Reagan. And then there are concerns about safety. Then there's the fact that the military doesn't have the anti-collision detection systems that many of the commercial planes have as well. There are so many questions. To focus on DEI seems to be, well, again, politics. There's also the question about Trump jumping up, talking about this issue so quickly. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, Trump did not need to insert himself in the story so closely by making, I guess, premature judgments about what may or may not have happened. Yes, it was appropriate for him to be, I guess, the nation's griever in chief at a time of tragedy like this. This is a traditional role for presidents. But on the other issue, in terms of this particular airport, you know, I'm not an aviation expert, but I find it unfathomable that so much helicopter activity occurs near the airport. Now, partly this is because, as I understand it, the military runs a bit of a taxi service for VIPs flying into town.
This one apparently, though, wasn't that. This was that they were doing a training exercise for a doomsday scenario where they had to evacuate people straight away out of it. The only issue is that I can't imagine that 67 people were flying from Wichita at the same time on a regional jet. Choose your time. The other aspect seems to be that in the air traffic control tower, one of the two people who were there decided to go home early. The military is used to that not changing down to one person until after 9:30. The accident happened before 9 o'clock. This was a communication issue, surely.
Yeah, look, no doubt there have been a series of worst case scenarios that have occurred. And yeah, while this may not have been part of regular traffic that occurs around the airport, it just seems unfathomable.
They often say in the aviation industry that for a plane to be able to successfully fly, 1 million things have to go right. In this case, it sounds like quite a few things went wrong.
Yeah, but I think we can all be pretty well assured that that if DEI played a role in this, it's pretty minor.
All right. Jewish communities in Sydney are ramping up security measures as they face a surge in anti-Semitic attacks. This is the headline from the Daily Mail. Australian Jews up security, conceal identity amid stream of anti-Semitic attacks. Police and private security now present at Jewish schools, ensuring the safety of students returning after the summer break. Now, recent incidents include graffiti, several locations, and also a thwarted explosives attack, heightening fears within the community. I can't believe that this is happening in Australia.
Yeah, how did it come to this? Certainly the Australia that I know and grew up in was an Australia that was insulated from a lot of the problems around the world. Well,
how did we get here, right? How did we end up with thousands of pro-Palestinians marching in cities? Last year we watched the protests against Israel and the destruction that we saw in Gaza happening at universities across Australia. People were being kicked off grounds if they were protesting against the protesters, while we saw too. What are your views on what has happened? How did we get to this stage?
Politically, things have changed a bit, and there are certain, I guess, extremes of politics I guess it's flowing onto the streets. What I mean by that is there have been for years concerns about the so-called extreme right, your kind of more traditional anti-Semitic protesters, neo-Nazis, that kind of thing. But what we've seen on the other side of politics is, I guess, a legitimisation of anti-Semitism there as well. Now, a lot of the people marching on the streets every Sunday here in Melbourne, they are, expressing a view about the current situation in the Middle East. And they are legitimate concerns to raise. But the problem is there is a more extreme end, I would say the extreme left, who are prepared to I guess, basically engage in very sort of violent in terms of language and actions.
Well, we've seen that, right? We've seen cars that have been spray painted with F the Jews. We've seen buildings as well. It seems to be happening more regularly in both Melbourne and Sydney too. We've also seen that you talk about the idea of a legitimate protest. The challenge is that anti-Zionism can easily become anti-Semitism. And then we've got this really strange thing I've been noticing on the news, which is the pro-Palestinian marchers who are anti-Jewish, or at least anti-actions of Benjamin Netanyahu, who are then being confronted by neo-Nazis who now seem to be sticking up for the Jews. It's the most bizarre situation I've ever seen.
Yeah, look, it's a very confusing mix and something like we haven't really seen before. But I think let's go back to October 2023, and we saw almost instantly, before Israel actually had retaliated against what occurred, we saw what happened on the steps of the Sydney Opera House. We saw what happened in the streets of Lakemba in Sydney.
Well, I mean, they were chanting "Gas the Jews."
Yeah, well, I guess, or whatever it was, that has been sort of somewhat disputed by the police.
Well, there have been a few people who have said, eyewitnesses who were there, that's what they heard.
Well, I actually think the actual words are actually quite irrelevant. It was an extremely menacing policing scene that should not be occurring in this country. But what we have is a government, a national Australian government, that for 12 months or so has been insipidly weak. They've got the Greens on one side snapping at their heels, and on the other side they have certain voting blocks in Western Sydney
and Western Melbourne.
And yes, and that has really hamstrung the government in terms of its response.
That's quite frightening. If you think about John Howard and that famous moment after Port Arthur, where he stood up against, he was new into power, and he stood up against his own coalition partners, voters being Nationals, by banning guns, by banning these weapons. And he stood there famously in his flak jack, which I think he regrets ever wearing, but he did what was right for the country, bad perhaps for politics, but the rest of the country supported him. And there does seem to be this overarching view within Australians, they don't like drama. Let's talk about the caravan, the explosive caravan that was detected by accident, and this breakdown in communication between the New South Wales Premier's office, we understand, as well as the Prime Minister's office, the role of police and the federal police. What do we know?
Well, it appears that the New South Wales Police informed the Premier pretty promptly of what occurred, and certainly in my experience of working in the office of the New South Wales Premier, there's pretty much a hotline between those two offices. So things went as planned there. But in terms of why the Prime Minister was not informed of this, I'm kind of not so sure. Yes, that would have been a matter for the federal police to inform the Prime Minister's office of that, or at the very least the responsible minister. But also subsequent, even putting aside the federal police, there was a national cabinet meeting after this news became. This news was out there. It wasn't mentioned there. The New South Wales Premier met the Prime Minister, and it wasn't mentioned during that discussion. It kind of makes no sense, but it really does speak to this broader issue of I guess the leadership style of Anthony Albanese and the command he has over the job.
Let's have a listen to the opposition leader Peter Dutton speaking about this.
If the Prime Minister of our country is not across what was potentially the biggest terrorist attack in our country's history, essentially until the public found out about it, I think that is an absolute abrogation of his responsibility.
Now, we compare this to Donald Trump, who came out very forcefully, we were just talking about that before, following this plane crash in DC. And yet the Australian Prime Minister finding out, along with everybody else, something which really, I mean, we expect that there are conversations happening all the time. We've heard some suggestions that there was a fear that it would become political if the AFP was to let the Prime Minister's office know. That's terrifying in itself.
Yeah, fear of it becoming political. Well, hello, where are we now? So this is just...
But why are they fearing that? Why are they fearing a political conversation about a group of people putting together explosives in a caravan and having a list of Jewish targets? That is politics.
Oh, exactly. It's totally unfathomable why the federal police didn't inform the Prime Minister's office unless there has been I guess a request from the Prime Minister's office that they are not informed of operational matters like this.
Plausible deniability.
Well, exactly. That's really concerning. I mean, are you the leader of this country or not?
All right. A controversial report by the Home Office's Extremism Review has drawn backlash for linking classic British sitcoms to far-right activity. This is the report from the Daily Mail, controversial Home Office extremism report written by a group that claimed liking that TV show on the BBC, The Thick of It, makes you far right. Now, the leaked document crafted by civil servants in the Prevent scheme has sparked outrage, suggesting that enjoying shows like The Thick of It signifies extremist tendencies. Critics calling for the dismissal of the Home Office staff responsible for the claims, particularly as the report also attempts to exploit concerns over grooming gangs for political gains. you and I would be in a lot of trouble as we both love this show.
Yeah, look, you know, Malcolm Tucker is is now some kind of you know, a Hitler character or Goebbels.
Can you understand why bureaucrats in the UK wouldn't like this show, though?
Oh, I could understand why they would hate this show. They've been, you know, and they probably hate Yes Prime Minister as well, or even though it might be a bit of a textbook for some of their behaviour. I mean, this really just speaks to, I guess, the bubble that some civil servants in the UK are in, and this is pretty common. In government circles, where...
Why do they love to ban everything? Like, why do they get in and feel like we have to protect you from yourself and from watching things? I mean, this is the BBC.
Yeah, look, this is just a behaviour of people who work inside government that seems to be incurable. There is a desire to control, and that's why, even in a liberal democracy, there is always this need to control. Now, how this is conflated...
Are we liberal democracies anymore, or are we simply social democracies that, particularly when you have a left-wing government in power, there is a tendency, we've seen it in Australia many, many times. I remember when Stephen Conroy, who was Communications Minister during the Gillard-Rudd years in Australia, was looking at banning types of pornography, where the government would decide what was okay and what wasn't okay. It was essentially defeated because the people do not want this overreach. Now, COVID came along and people were being banned off YouTube, cancelled if they questioned the vaccine. Do you think that that has led to, post-COVID, governments being able to step in a bit more and tell you what you can or can't watch?
Yeah, look, the whole COVID experience was a gigantic worldwide experiment in how citizens of so-called liberal democracies, how compliant they would be, and for the most part was actually pretty successful.
And voted some governments back in, but kicked others out.
Indeed, but you know, bureaucrats cannot help themselves but try and control the behaviour of the public. I mean, there's this whole scene or whole sphere of behavioural economics or nudging, and the UK is the home of it, where they try just to, you know, just try and change behaviour of people, sometimes for good, but you know, I think there's an ethical question there.
You and I are in our 40s, so we're not that old, but we're certainly older than people in their 20s and 30s, right? And something that I've found interesting, there's an article in the Australian newspaper today talking about how about 50% of young people say that they only vote because they don't want to get the fine. There are other surveys that say young people actually have a tendency to look towards communist policies and say, what's wrong with that? That makes sense. What do you think the reason for that is? Do you think it's because we're so far away from seeing the bad side of the Soviet Union? You and I were at the tail end of seeing that from a generation standpoint. Have we become soft? We get the governments we deserve. Do the next generation want a government that bans everything?
Oh, I think we've become ignorant. We've become ignorant about what happened during the 20th century. You know, a lot of people have heard about Hitler, but how many people can tell you that Stalin was responsible for the death of millions more, or Mao in China?
Yeah. With his 5-year plans that killed so many people because he tried to move away from the land into making things, and there's a crossover period which isn't great for eating.
Or even Pol Pot in Cambodia. We've forgotten the evils.
So what you think is that we're able to identify what far right extremism looks like, but never what far left extremism looks like?
I think there is a sense of looking at the extreme left through rose-coloured glasses, and that's part of, I guess, that's part of the political zeitgeist of today that you see on social media.
All right. Australia is set to review the treatment of transgender youth as the federal government announces a comprehensive medical assessment. This is the story we're looking at from the Sydney Morning Herald. Puberty blockers and treatments for trans youth now under review. The Health Minister, Mark Butler, revealing that advice on puberty blockers is expected by mid-next year, a treatment previously banned in the UK due to insufficient evidence. These pictures you're watching here from the ABC in Australia. Now, the National Health and Medical Research Council will create new guidelines amidst a rapid rise in young people transitioning, which has increased tenfold over the last decade. Increased tenfold. Now, this is an interesting fact in itself. What do you think the reasons for it are?
The reasons for the increased prevalence, there's a lot of thought that has gone into this, but there are some theories that suggest that social media, certain social media platforms over the past 10 or so years have been associated with this. Other people would say, however, that because we're more open as a society, we can discuss it more, and therefore
which is a fair argument, by the way.
That is also
if you talk about things, police statistics obviously show that there's often a rise in domestic violence when there's conversation about domestic violence and people feel comfortable in being able to report domestic violence. That there isn't necessarily a rise in the numbers, it's just people saying it more regularly. I mean, right through history we've seen people transition, and I can't personally imagine how difficult it would be to feel that I was born into the wrong gender's body. I would imagine that that would be quite terrible. It is interesting that over the weekend we saw government websites in the US go dark, and that was because the US government was removing LGBTQ plus and changing it to just LGB. And some of the reaction on social media I've seen has been, now that there's a divorce between the trans community and the lesbian, gay, bisexual community, that is a good thing because the two were actually never the same, both strong issues. What are your thoughts?
Well, this does sort of somewhat remind me of the scene from Monty Python's Life of Brian and the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea, and all sorts of different labels. I think that people have become somewhat obsessed by labels over the past 10 or so years, and labels that have not really existed for thousands of years of human civilization, but suddenly are so
from
central.
2014 through to 2025.
Yeah, why is that? Why is that?
Well, I mean, some would say it's because we've become more enlightened.
Possibly some people would say that, but others would say that this is the result of dare I say, mass hysteria. I probably wouldn't go that far to
Let's talk
support
about
that.
the issue in Australia. So in Queensland, we've seen some changes there from the new government, and also now the federal government in Australia trying to head it off as an election issue. What are they suggesting?
Yeah, so quite recently, the Queensland government announced that it was going to end so-called gender-affirming treatment for those under 18. That was followed really a couple of days later by this announcement from the federal government that the National Health and Medical Research Council would review this form of treatment. Now, that does suggest to me that this is a move from the federal government to just try and cauterise this as an issue and get it off the agenda as we approach the election. Now, I certainly don't see it becoming a major election issue in this country, but we have seen before that it does. Sometimes the issue does appear around the periphery. You look at the Liberal Party in Victoria; it tore the Liberal Party in Victoria apart, and it ended up in court. And now the former opposition leader has a massive defamation bill to pay.
No one wins from these conversations.
No. It's an issue.
It's also such a deeply personal issue. I feel uncomfortable talking about it because I'm not someone who feels these ways, right? And I feel like there's nothing worse than having people tell you what you should feel when you're living it yourself. The only thing I would say is that we have age limits for alcohol and for driving and for particularly voting. And the idea of being able to transition as a youth seems to be, are you ready to make such massive commitments? That's my only, I suppose, opinion on it. But again, I'm not living with it.
Well, if you look into the wording of Trump's executive order on the issue, he described, in that order, he described a lot of the thinking behind this as junk science. That is, I guess the point that's being made there is that a lot of, that there is no firm scientific evidence to back up a lot of this so-called gender-affirming care. It is ideology, not science. And that is where, I guess, that is where Trump is now. That is where the US government is now. That is where the UK has gone following the Cass review. But Australia is not quite there yet. So we'll see what this review provides. But will it become a federal election issue because it's off the agenda? I don't think so. I think it'll still be discussed.
Comedian John Mulaney delivered a cheeky dig at Prince Harry and Meghan Markle while promoting his upcoming Netflix talk show Everybody's Live with John Mulaney during that recent event. Fox News says Prince Harry and Meghan Markle mocked by the comedian at the Netflix event. I mean, there were some really big names at this event, it's worth pointing out there as well, who were standing by and listening to this, giggling along with him. He noted that Netflix has invested heavily in projects like his show without a clear plan, which he says is reminiscent of their deal with Harry and Meghan. Meanwhile, Meghan has postponed her show With Love, Meghan to March 4 due to the LA wildfires, a movie that aims to reshape her public image. I feel like Meghan is continually trying to reshape her public image and now is becoming the butt of jokes in America.
Yep, the butt of jokes in America at an event run by an organisation that apparently
paying millions.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I think they're finished. I think Harry and Meghan...
But what does finished mean? I mean, what do they do? Go live in a hut?
Well, maybe they could just go and get a real job rather than putting forward these ridiculous programs that no one wants to watch, like Polo, for God's sake. And then we've got With Love, Meghan.
That's a cooking show, isn't it?
It's a cooking show. She's. I did see it described over the weekend. She's trying to be a $2 shop Martha Stewart. So.
That's just nasty, Ash.
But the thing is, the thing is, Martha Stewart, she's got a bit of a hard edge to her, and she embraces that. We know that she's a.
I wouldn't want to work for her, right? I mean, that's the whole concept of her. She's hard to work for, but she's a perfectionist.
But Meghan just tries to be this nice, normal person, nice, lovely, caring person, and yet we hear about former staffers of hers requiring therapy. So I think the problem is here that everyone, I think, has now woken up to the fact that she's a fake.
But does she have a fan base? I mean, surely Netflix, who they're really famous for being able to choose people and shows. You think about Squid Games that are perhaps not going to be a hit, that all of a sudden become a massive hit. Their algorithm, the science behind the choosing, do you think they put that all out the window because they just wanted to get the Sussexes on board? Or do you think that there is a fan base for Meghan out there that just doesn't get infected by what John Mulaney says or what Fox News says?
Oh, I think there is a niche, and perhaps you should just focus on the niche rather than trying to be...
What do you think the niche is?
I think that we go back to some of her commentary about being a victim of media bullying and so on. I think that's a message that appeals to some. Well, I think it probably appeals to bullies themselves, people who claim to be bullied and yet are terrible bullies. Maybe that's the niche. In any case,
They do have a habit of inserting themselves into a lot of things though, right? Like you think about them turning up to the LA wildfires a couple of weeks ago and there was a question of what are they doing there? Because if you don't want to be royals, and I've covered, and I know you have as well, a lot of royal tours in Australia where they come, I think about William and Kate who went to Kerrang in the aftermath of terrible fires up that way and terrible accidents as well. And they go and essentially pay tribute to the people. It's a royal duty, and it feels like the Sussexes perform royal duties when it suits them.
Well, yeah, all they want to do is the photo op. Now, the thing about covering royal tours is that, yeah, there's that 5 minutes that creates good pictures for TV and so on, but there is hours and hours of drudgery, and the late Queen was famous for this. Princess Anne is famous for this. There's a lot of the boring stuff that goes with that 5 minutes of glamour.
Oh gosh, could you imagine some of the events you would have to attend as a member of the royal family?
Yes, look, it would be pretty soul destroying, but look, hey, it's very well compensated.
All right, we always appreciate your thoughts, Ashley Garter. Thank you.
Thank you.